All right, this is The Fragments by Heraclitus. I found this on archive.org. Tradition 2022. Page 2 is blank. Page 3, translation and commentary and the Greek text. William Harris, Professor Emeritus, Middlebury College. Fourth page blank. Fifth page, preface. Heraclitus was born at Ephesus, apparently from a noble family connected with religious rites, but early retired from their social position and devoted himself to study and the development of his philosophical ideas. There are no specific dates to attach to his life, but he must have flourished somewhere about 500 BC. He is said to have written his thoughts out in a prose document, a very early use of prose for philosophy, of which only fragmentary quotations have survived as citations from later authors over the next 1500 years. There is almost nothing more which we know about Heraclitus' personal life and identity. This paper contains all of the fragments which can authoritatively be ascribed to Heraclitus, following the listing in Dielskrantz, Die Fragmenta der Vorsokratiker, 5th edition, 1934, and reprints. The interpretive commentary is designed to explicate the often difficult wording of the Greek rather than summarize the body of philological study which has been devoted to Heraclitus over the last 200 years. The Greek is absolutely necessary for serious study of Heraclitus, and this edition, with all the fragments in a topical order, lets us look at Heraclitus in one authentic location. The thought of this Greek philosopher, whom Aristotle first called the obscure, has exerted an important influence on modern thinking about a wide variety of subjects, including religion, the nature of the universe, the concept of the continuum, and other points, some of which have not yet been sufficiently fathomed. I encourage you to proceed with slow and careful reading. Okay. So, next page, page 6. Alright, so we'll do one page at a time for the phone. So I'll get really short uploads, which I think is what I want. And then I could do a full upload once I do that. Okay, let's do that. Next. Heraclitus Fragments, page 6. The Way of the Logos. 1. Although this Logos is eternally valid, yet men are unable to understand it, not only before hearing it, but even after they have heard it for the first time. That is to say, although all things come to pass in accordance with this Logos, men seem to be quite without any experience of it, at least if they are judged in the light of such words and deeds as I am here setting forth according to its nature, and to specify how it behaves. Other men, on the contrary, are as unaware of what they do when awake as they are when asleep. Then here's some Greek text. As soon as one starts to deal with the Greek and the sub-meanings of the original wording, the above translation becomes cloudy and perhaps weak, yet it will serve as an entry text to serve as ancilla to the Greek, which has the true way into understanding the mind of Heraclitus. It is interesting that Aristotle, in discussing this passage, raises the grammatical question of whether the word always goes with what is before it, the eternal logos, or after it, as always failed to understand. Arist, Rhetor 1407b. But this is just the first of myriad questions about this fecund passage, which has occupied the best classical and philosophical wits for centuries. Distinguishing things according to the nature sounds much like Aristotle's approach to data, starting from observation and use, rather than from ideal pattern, but is better aligned with use of the word phusis by the early philosophers. Heraclitus, Fragments, page 7. We should let ourselves, 2. We should let ourselves be guided by what is common to all, yet although the Logos is common to all, most men live as if each of them had a private intelligence of his own. And then there's some Greek. 3. Men who love wisdom should acquaint themselves with a great many particulars. Heraclitus stresses particulars and facts, but in the next statement, he maintains that accumulations of fact do not confer wisdom or nome. Why this odd difference of point of view? Because both are relevant and important. Information is, of course, essential, but as it is assembled, it becomes a static corpus and possible encumbrance to the thinker and philosopher, even as a full philological documentation of opinions on these fragments of Heraclitus can obscure the words of the statements. 4. Seekers after gold dig up much earth and find little. What could be a better description of mining, whether gold or uranium, or the continuing processes of serious scientific research? Much labor, often no or few returns. That is the nature of the investigation of new ideas. 5. Let us not make arbitrary conjectures about the greatest matters. I'm going to redo that one. Let's do all. That one. Delete. Yeah, I'm going to delete that one. I stuttered a little too much on that one, so let's do a second take. There. Video facing me. All right. Heraclitus Fragments, page 2. Nope. Page 2. Page 7. I'm on number 2. Let's try that again. Heraclitus Fragments, page 7. 2. We should let ourselves be guided by what is common to all, yet although the Logos is common to all, most men live as if each of them had a private intelligence of his own. And then there's the Greek. 3. Men who love wisdom should acquaint themselves with a great many particulars. And then the Greek. Heraclitus stresses particulars and fact, but in the next statement, he maintains that accumulations of fact do not confer wisdom or nome. Why this odd difference of point of view? Because both are relevant and important. Information is, of course, essential, but as it is assembled, it becomes a static corpus and possible encumbrance to the thinker and philosopher, even as a full philological documentation of opinions on these fragments of Heraclitus can obscure the words of the statements. 4. Seekers after gold dig up much earth and find little. And then there's the Greek. What could be a better description of mining, whether gold or uranium, or the continuing processes of serious scientific research? Much labor, often no or few returns. That is the nature of the investigation of new ideas. 5. Let us not make arbitrary conjectures about the greatest matters. And then the Greek. Okay, that's page 7. Heraclitus Fragments, page 8. But the world is replete with arbitrary views, not only in the world of history, politics, and theology, but forever in academy, where they work against the nature of the search after truth. 6. Much learning does not teach understanding. Otherwise, it would have taught Hesiod and Pythagoras, Xenophanes and Hecataeus. And then there's some Greek. Anyone who has spent time in higher education will be painfully aware of the learned views which go nowhere and shed no light at all. All those possible points of view which fills the pages of learned journals crowd the path to understanding. Yet knowing much is also something Heraclitus stresses, so we are caught between the jaws of ignorance and encyclopediaism. 7. Of those whose discourses I have heard there is not one who attains to the realization that wisdom stands apart from all else. And then there's the Greek. The problem of distinguishing knowledge from wisdom is with us forever. Our college courses teach knowledge of many things, but the wisdom which comes from education seems to be more of a personal and even spiritual nature than a result of accumulation and accreditation. Can students be denied a top grade because they lack wisdom? Or is this considered a transcendental factor couched in mental talent or taught by experience in life? Heraclitus Fragments, page 9. 8. I have searched myself. Greek. These two words speak volumes. Self-examination is the hardest thing to do, something Freud had to learn slowly, and he spent much of his life doing just this. It is not a simple truism that the unsearched life is not life at all. 9. It pertains to all men to know themselves and to be temperate. Greek. 10. To be temperate is the greatest virtue. Wisdom consists in speaking and acting the truth, giving heed to the nature of things. Greek. The Greek word sophrosun is hard to define, since it comes from the adjective seos, safe, and phron, mind. It points to a mind which is well-centered and thoughtful, balanced and poised for intelligent judgments. English temperate from Latin temperatus as moderate is much more complicated, going back to Latin tempus, time, the right time, season, and the English core of the word points to being in touch with an external situation, whether season, social setting, or proper time for a given action. But the English word has other associations, such as temperance as avoidance of alcohol, temper as ire and anger, box well-adjusted, harpsichord playing well-tempered variations, and even the blacksmith carefully drawing the temper of overly hard, quenched steel. The Greek has none of these external associations. It is self-centered and a business of the mind, which when held in a cane stance will be the proper tool for thought. All right. Heraclitus Fragments, page 10. 11. The things of which there can be sight, hearing, and learning. These are what I especially prize. Greek. At first, H seems to be putting special emphasis on authentic observation, what the Greeks termed autopsia, or direct fact-finding, something one himself sees. But he continues with the argument, but 12. Eyes are more accurate witnesses than ears. Greek. Visual information is more direct than hearing, by which he surely means hearsay rather than acoustic perception. But again, 13. Eyes and ears are bad witnesses to men having barbarian souls. Greek. The best direct observation is worthless without the right mental grasp. One thinks of 17th C drawings of planets as seen in a telescope, in which the rings were seen as separate brackets rather than a ring seen from an oblique angle. Until the mind is prepared, even the best optical observations are liable to misrepresentation. And in the case of grossly uneducated minds of the barbaroi, seeming facts based on eye, ear, or hearsay are of little importance per se. Heraclitus Fragments, page 11. 14. One should not act or speak as if he were asleep. Greek. We know about the curious phenomenon of sleepwalking, but Heraclitus turns to something much more serious, which is quasi-sleep talking. The conscious and rational part of the mind is turned off as in sleep, but the words continue to flow. We go through motions and actions as if we were awake, but it is a kind of conditioned reflex. To really think about something is quite different from thinking that it is a right, that it will serve. 15. The waking have one world in common. Greek. Each sleeper turns away to a private world of his own. Heraclitus precedes Jung in his notion of the sleep world as a private chamber of the unconscious mind, a place which has an unclear connection with the waking world. Yet, this is real to the sleeper. It is a world too, but personal and private one. 16. Death is what we see when awake. When we are asleep, it is dreams. Greek. This curious remark must mean that the world of the living is conditionally in process of dying. Everything we see in our daily lives is either coming into being or going out of being into death. But in our dream world, there is no death because dreams are unreal and do not face the problem of going out of being. One step further on this path might lead to Plato and his eternal idea world, imperishable and permanent, still taught in coursework in academy, but already invalidated in the later 4th century. Heraclitus, Fragments, page 12. 17. Nature loves to hide itself. Greek. Anyone who has worked in scientific research knows well the 1,000 ways in which things disappear again and again just as they begin to seem clear. It seems to be an almost intentional trickiness of the situation that layer after layer of camouflage must be removed before we can find what we are looking for. But this is not just in science. It is the same in all phases of human thought and investigation. 18. The Lord, whose oracle is at Delphi, neither speaks nor conceals, but gives signs. Greek. Unfortunately, the English gives signs is quite different from the German Semenein, which, since it is used for hand signals, the directional indications of the policeman at the corner, or the signing system of communication of the deaf. The Greek word can be used for indicating with a word an expression or a thought, and here it is used for the act of giving an interpretation. But if I translate the oracle gives interpretations, that is again in the wrong direction, since it would be taken as speaking and oral messaging. The real point Heraclitus is making seems to be this. The oracle responds with indirect information rather than words. He intimates things rather than indicating them. So going to ask the oracle a question will give you a puzzle of some sort, relevant indirectly rather than a response to your question. Heraclitus, Fragments, page 13. 19. Unless you expect the unexpected, you will never find truth, for it is hard to discover and hard to attain. Greek. Einstein is recorded as stating that his sole original interest was in the phenomenon of light, which on the basis of faith he felt to be supremely important. This unexpected insight, coupled with his lifelong dogged determination, is what brought him finally in the direction of his major conclusions about light. The idea of the continuum. 20. They do not step into the same rivers. It is other and still other waters that are flowing. Greek. There is the classic statement of the continuum for which Heraclitus is so famous then and now that little comment is necessary. But the words which follow directly, see below, are most strange. On first thought, they would seem to be a scribe's edition of something quite different, a scrap which he had to fit in somewhere. Given the river and waters, this might be a good place for this insertion. But could it be that souls themselves derive from the continuum, that since they are in similar process of continual change, that they can be best described in terms of Heraclitus' river imagery? Best watch this carefully and suspend judgment here. So, and souls take their spirit from the waters. Greek. Heraclitus Fragments, page 14. 21. You cannot step twice into the same river for other waters, and yet others go ever flowing on. They go forward and back again. Greek. These two statements pose clearly the problems of the continuum as inherent in the nature of things. It is not the same river, obviously, since the water has all moved along downstream, nor is it the same you, since each instant your physical nature has replenished and recreated parts of itself. This may seem contrary to our common sense notions of daily living, but fits well with the idea of modern social relativity, in which the normal state is one of motion. Yet the common view of many people is that all is static, even our lives and bodies, of course, quite wrongly. One might ask the oracle at Delphi if the Logos is in continual change too, a changing master plan which suits the changing world which it informs. 22. Cool things become warm. The warm grows cool. The moist dries. The parched becomes moist. Greek. Here is a possibly trace of the above notion about souls taking their nature from the rivers, spirits somehow alembicated from the liquids. It seems hardly necessary to refer to the second law of thermodynamics with its statement about the even flow of heat in a milieu of constant energy transfer. We know that the flow of heat is from hot to cool, is normally in one direction. However, Heraclitus had already added a consideration above about a two-way equation in the words. They go forward and back again. Greek. Heraclitus Fragments, page 15. 23. It is in changing that things find repose. Greek. In a world in which motion is the normal state, there may be an apparent but temporary state of what we see as static repose. In other words, there is a seeming repose, but only as a byproduct of the process of continual change. Perhaps this is something of which we get a psychological snapshot, like a single motion picture frame and a slurry of moving images. In other words, there may possible be static moments in the continuum. 24. Time is a child moving counters in a game. The royal power is a child's. Greek. This is a brilliant figure. The word child in Greek is nepios, referring to a child who cannot yet speak, hence a very young child indeed. This mere infant is randomly moving pieces on a checkerboard, and Heraclitus intuitively feels that this randomizing activity is the ruling power of the world. Is this not the key to biological evolution, randomly moving genes in an infinity of time? The Greek word basilia does mean kingdom or royal power, but there may be another interpretation, which I offer tentatively. In the ancient checkers game, which dates far back into ancient Persia, the termination of the game by stalling the king is called checkmate, which is understood to be Iranian for Shah Mata, or king dead. Note the skits murtas, dead, as cognate with Latin, lat, mort, mortalis, etc. Could this fragment mean that the child who moves pieces continually without knowing what he is doing will eventually arrive at a checkmate? Heraclitus Fragments, page 16. Perhaps far-fetched to us, but a theoretical statistician would have no problem with this at all. 25. War is both father and king of all. Some he has shown forth as gods and others as men. Some he has made slaves and others free. Greek. Especially in the post-industrial age, when war has become far more than squadrons of men crossing borders to pilfer a neighboring tribe, we have come to think of war with fear, horror, and emotional distaste. So it will seem surprising to read Heraclitus' word on Ptolemos as the king. It would be nice to find him couching another meaning with the philosophical content, but that is hardly possible, since the words are quite clear. But suspend judgment here, and let us read on to the next paragraph, which carries the figure of war further along. 26. It should be understood that war is the common condition, that strife is justice, and that all things come to pass through the compulsion of strife. Greek. For Heraclitus, war is the upsetting factor which moves static situations into unwilling change. We try to write laws which will last forever, find again and again. They have a short half-life. War goes further and destroys the balance of law, initiating even further rates of change than economic development and social change. The history of the West might unfortunately be written as the history of Western warfare, and a great deal of advance in technology, from gunpowder to atomic energy, has its origins in the requirements for war-based devices. Heraclitus is speaking of war as accelerator of change, but that notion Heraclitus Fragments, page 17, verges instantly into the realm of political warfare for which we have been paying high costs for a long time. 27. Homer was wrong in saying, "Would that strife might perish from amongst gods and men, for if that were to occur, then all things would cease to exist." The three statements above take war as a normal state, since it is changing in itself and also changing relationships between states and people. Strife, war, and even disease are, in Heraclitus' terms, essential components of the human universe. Despite our attempts, usually puerile and futile, to live in a world of equanimous peacefulness, there is an unrest and dissent which constantly emerges. It may be change of attitude, opinion, or it may be the shifts in the stock market and national boundaries and the armies which march from here to there, bringing in change. This may not be optimal, but it has been part of the historical scene from the start, and does not seem inclined to go away in these early years of the new millennium. On nature. Something must be said at the start about that word, nature, which is a poor and misleading translation of the Greek. Physis, or physis in Greek, is a word which traces its ancestry back to the Indo-European root, bu, which means be, become, and is cognate with words spread throughout the European tongues, with many examples from Latin, fui, to modern English, be. In Greek, the word was used to outline the idea of coming into being, or being as the end result of a process of generation. Being and becoming are quite different notions, as are sein and werden in German. The Greeks saw physis as the process by which things came into being, how they became, what they turned out to be, and in their usage, the word became a key term for the evolving world which they saw all around them. This is quite different from the Hebrew God making the world by design in a week of work. It sees the world as a long Alright, one sec. It's getting a little chilly in here. I'm going to disconnect my controller so I can turn this little heat lamp on. And let's turn the propane on as well. That way, I don't have to be freezing while I'm doing this. Alright. Page 18. Heraclitus Fragments, page 18. Cess of becoming, and it is becomingness, which characterizes their idea of the world in which they lived. The Romans, who had studied their Greek philosophers, well needed a Latin translation for the un-Roman aspirated f and lipped u sounds of physis. This started with the Latin verb nascor, put a noun ending onto the past participle natus, and came up with natura as natural for physis. To an educated Roman, the new term natura meant physis exactly. English has other meanings galore. We speak of a man's nature and his character as his character. We say naturally when we mean logically, and we rejoice in the pleasures of nature in the park, garden, and woodlands. So when we discuss a group of Heraclitus' thoughts which are neatly labeled under the title on nature, we are starting off on the wrong foot, unless we specifically equate nature with physis in all its philosophical contexts. We do, however, want a familiar English word for a title, so on nature will have to suffice. Now we can proceed to the fragments. 28. There is exchange of all things for fire, and of fire for all things, as there is of wares for gold, and of golds for wares. Greek. This is nothing less than a brilliant intuitive statement, although without scientific or mathematical proof, of the idea behind Einstein's E equals mc squared. Fire is the nearest thing the Greek could imagine for our idea of energy. Although static electric forces were incidental in the Greek world, fire did seem to have some of the dissolving and combining capacities which we referred to as energy. Fire is, of course, one form of energy, and perceiving fire as a building force under aegis of the sun's fire, as well as a destroying force in the flames of the hearth, is not only intuitive, it is largely correct. Oh, yeah. Let's get a little stretch in. Alright, I think once I hit 20, I'll go ahead and stop the loom. Since my internet kind of sucks, I don't want the loom videos to be too long. But yeah, I think like 40 to 50 minutes. I think that's what I should... Yeah, maybe under an hour. Okay. Let's take a swig of some water. Oh no, that's not the right water. That's an empty bottle. Oh shit. Here we go. That's what I'm looking for. Got my gallon. Oh, that's delicious. Honestly, I have never enjoyed water so much as I do after reading. Seriously, even like the most intense physical activity that I do, I think water just tastes way better when I'm reading. Maybe that's something I should incorporate more. Okay. Page 19. Okay. Heraclitus Fragments, page 19. The figure of the marketplace is striking as an explanatory equation. As money and products represent a two-way equation, so energy and mass objects also stand in a two-way relationship. Some may find this interpretation difficult to see, but A, it fits the Greek words closely, and B, unless we go this way, what meaning does this fragment have at all? Strange as it sounds, this is no hocus pocus of an ancient vein of alchemy. It is a rational statement couched in terms of a Greek proportional equation. On the left side are A goes to B, which are seen as parallel in their operation to C goes... Oh, no, sorry. I'll do reversible arrow. A reversible arrow B, which are seen as parallel in their operation as C reversible arrow D. In the marketplace of the universe, item A can be transformed into item B and back again, just as products can be turned into dollars and dollars to products again. How Heraclitus happened to think this through is startling, but there are many key points in Greek, pre-science, which anticipate modern investigations. Lucretius, as summarizer of Epicurean science, lists a few of them. Probably a surprise to the Latin student of Roman poetry, the law of conservation of energy, the law of conservation of matter, a clear statement of animal evolution, molecular interlocking. All this should come as no surprise for their awakened. Heraclitus had already said that there is a logos behind everything which we continually miss seeing. 29. This universe, which is the same for all, has not been made by any god or man, but it always has been and will be an ever-living fire, kindling itself by regular measures and going out by regular measures. Greek. Okay, let's see. Yeah, let's do one more. Okay. Heraclitus Fragments, page 20. Here is an interesting caution to modern science, which is now pressing hard on the origin of the universe at a specific place and moment in time, the original coming into being of the world as the Big Bang. Heraclitus' comment is that it has always been there and always will be, but the forms and stages are constantly changing. One suspects that if confronted by Big Bang theory, he would have said that the outblowing of energy from a single specific point in ancient time must be the turning point of an inburning of energy towards single point before that moment. Why assume a start when we find everything continually turning from one state to another without pause or interruption? Is the idea of an origin a catchword in our common vein of thinking? 30. He calls it craving and satiety, or satiety. Greek. One might compare a chemical situation which actively absorbs material into solution until it reaches the point of saturation, at which time it can absorb no more. The solution is thirsty. Then, at a certain level, it becomes saturated or satiated. 31. It throws apart and then brings together again. It advances and retires. Greek. We seem to have two separate fragments sutured together here. The first is the usual statement of the continuum in the river, while the second line has a very different meaning, which goes well into the previous, fragment 30, as an example of elements coming together in a combinatory process and then dissociating. This could be called, with our familiar word, synthesis, but balanced with an opposing diathesis. Okay, I'm going to call that for the first loom. It's 37 minutes and about 40 seconds.